The day my grandmother died, the sun vanished from my world. But it wasn't just grief that swallowed me whole, it was what came afterward. That night, my grandfather opened my bedroom door, and everything I thought I knew about love, safety, and family crumbled in a single, paralyzing moment. My name is Marjorie Reed. I'm 73 years old, and I've lived in Medora, North Dakota, nearly my entire life, though there were years I wished I could disappear from it. People around here know me as Miss Marjorie, the quiet widow who keeps to herself and tends to her vegetable garden like it's sacred. They think I'm peaceful, maybe even serene. But what they don't know is that for decades, I carried a truth so heavy it nearly crushed me. My story begins in a little white farmhouse just outside of town Modest, with chipped paint on the shutters and a front porch that creaked in protest every time someone walked across it. I was raised there by my grandparents, Evelyn and Walter Reed. My parents died in a car accident when I was 4. I don't remember much about them, just the soft murmur of my mother's voice when she sang me to sleep, and my father's laugh on the one birthday video we had left. After the accident, it was Grandma Evelyn who stepped in and saved me. She was warmth itself, flour on her apron, lavender in her dresser drawers, and a heart that loved with quiet steadiness. She'd brush my hair each night, tell me stories about angels and stars, and tuck me in with a kiss on the forehead. She made the world feel soft and safe. Grandpa Walt was different. He wasn't unkind back then, but he was distant, stern. I don't recall ever seeing him smile. He'd spend most of his days in the barn or out on the fields. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice was low, gravelly, and carried more weight than warmth. Still, with Grandma Evelyn around, I never felt afraid. She was my shield, always present, always watchful, until the morning she died. It was a chilly October day. I remember the leaves outside had turned amber and crimson, and the air carried that dry scent of autumn. Grandma had just made me oatmeal with cinnamon and was sitting by the window, knitting as always. She paused mid-row, pressed her hand to her chest, and collapsed. They said it was her heart. One moment she was there, humming to the sound of the wind outside. The next, she was gone, just like that. I was 12. The funeral was small and quiet, held at the local church on Elm Street. Folks from town came to pay their respects. My best friend, Jenny Malone, sat beside me, holding my hand the whole time. Grandpa Walt didn't shed a tear. He stood at the front of the church, stone-faced, staring at the closed casket like it offended him. That night, the house felt like a stranger, cold, echoing with silence. I lay in my bed, still in my funeral dress, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last words Grandma said to me. I think it was, "Always listen to your heart, baby. It'll tell you when something's not right." And then I heard the floorboards creak. At first, I thought it was the wind. The old house was always full of sounds, but the steps grew closer, measured, slow, heavy. The bedroom door creaked open. I sat up, heart pounding. "Grandpa," I whispered. He didn't say a word, just stepped inside and closed the door behind him. That was the moment my childhood ended. I didn't understand it all then. I only remember the smell of whiskey, the weight of his shadow, the coldness in his eyes, and I remember the scream that caught in my throat and never quite found its way out. After that night, silence became my survival to the outside world. I was just a quiet girl grieving her grandmother. At school, I smiled when people spoke to me, nodded when teachers asked questions. I still played jump rope with Jenny sometimes, still did my chores, still went to church every Sunday. But inside, I was a shattered shell of a girl learning how to disappear in plain sight. And Grandpa Walt, he went back to the fields, back to the barn, and back to the porch swing where he smoked his pipe in the evenings like nothing had changed. But everything had. And that's how it began, the long, dark chapter of my life that would shape everything that followed. Before the darkness came, my world was stitched together with the gentle hands of my grandmother, Evelyn Reed. We lived a simple life on the edge of Medora, North Dakota, where fields stretched out like an ocean and the sky seemed to touch the earth. Our house wasn't much, just 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a wood stove that kept us warm through the long winters. But to me, it was a castle, and Grandma Evelyn was my queen. She had soft silver hair always tied back in a bun, wore cotton dresses with floral prints, and smelled like peppermint and flour. Her hands were always busy kneading dough, sewing patches, tending to our little vegetable garden, but they never hesitated to pause and wrap around me whenever I needed comfort. I clung to her like a shadow. Every morning, she'd wake me with a song, usually some old hymn or lullaby, and a gentle touch to my cheek. We'd sit at the kitchen table while she made breakfast, telling me little stories from her childhood or humming as she stirred grits on the stove. She'd never rush me, never snap. Her patience was endless. In those quiet moments, I felt like the most loved girl in the world. School wasn't always easy. I was shy. I didn't make friends quickly, and the other girls sometimes teased me for living so far out of town. But I never minded too much because every afternoon, Grandma Evelyn would be waiting for me at the gate, waving with her apron still tied around her waist. Just seeing her smile made everything okay. She taught me how to read before I ever stepped foot in a classroom. We'd sit on the porch swing, and I'd sound out words while she nodded with pride. Later, she'd give me her old books to keep under my pillow at night. Fairy tales, psalms, even old recipes, anything that kept my imagination fed and my spirit strong. We did everything together, planted tomatoes in spring, canned peaches in summer, raked leaves in fall, and when the snow came down in thick sheets and the roads disappeared, we'd sit by the fire with her knitting needles clicking and me curled up at her feet with a book in my lap. Those were the years when I still laughed freely. Back then, I didn't know just how much Grandma Evelyn protected me. I saw glimpses of it, sure how her eyes narrowed when Grandpa Walt raised his voice at me, how she always found ways to keep me busy and close by her side. I remember one time when I accidentally spilled a glass of milk and Grandpa started shouting. I froze, but Grandma stepped between us like a shield. "She's just a child. Walt," she said firmly, "you calm yourself down." He stared at her for a long moment, jaw clenched, then stormed out the back door. Later, she knelt beside me, wiped away my tears, and whispered, "Don't let fear grow roots, sweetheart. You're not to blame for someone else's storm." I didn't understand it then, but now I know she was fighting to keep the darkness at bay, every single day. Grandpa Walt wasn't violent back then, not physically, at least, but his presence filled the house like smoke. He was strict, cold, and impossible to please. I don't remember him ever hugging me, not once. His love, if he had any, was locked up behind clenched fists and a stare that made my skin crawl. He rarely spoke to me unless I'd done something wrong. He'd grunt, scowl, shake his head. I used to try and win his approval sweeping the porch, folding the laundry perfectly, but nothing seemed to soften him. He had a temper that Grandma Evelyn somehow kept in check. It was like she held the reins of a wild horse and wouldn't let it bolt. Looking back, I realize how much she must have carried. It wasn't just me she protected. She was the glue that held the whole household together, the one who smoothed over Grandpa's bitterness with quiet dignity, who made sure I never felt unloved or unwanted. She never complained, not once. She'd hum while she worked, always humming, like it kept her grounded. I remember asking her once, "Why do you sing all the time?" "Grandma." She smiled and tapped her chest. "Because it keeps the sadness from building up in here. Music's like sunshine for the soul, even now, decades later. I still find myself humming that same tune, especially when the memories get too loud." I used to believe she was unbreakable, but time, it seems, doesn't spare anyone. She started tiring more easily that last year. Her hands shook when she folded laundry, and she sat down more often to rest. I remember asking if she was okay. She just patted my head and said, "I'm just getting older. Baby, don't you worry about me." But I did worry. I worried every time she gripped the edge of the counter a little too tightly, or when she pressed her hand to her chest and winced. Something was happening, but I didn't know what to do. I was only 12. Then came that morning in October, the one that changed everything. She'd just poured me a bowl of oatmeal, added a dash of brown sugar like always, and sat at the window with her knitting. The sun poured through the glass in soft gold, making her hair glow. Then she froze. Her needles slipped from her hands. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She reached out toward me, then collapsed, and just like that, she was gone. The ambulance came too late. Grandpa Walt didn't cry. I did so hard I couldn't breathe. At the hospital, I remember clutching her knitting bag and whispering the words she used to say to me, "You're safe, my little dove." But I wasn't. Not anymore. The only person who ever truly loved me was gone. And what I didn't know then, what I couldn't even begin to imagine, was that the very man who stood beside her grave would become the source of my greatest pain. The morning Grandma died is carved into my memory like a scar that never fades. It was October 14th, 1962. I remember the smell of cinnamon. She had made oatmeal like she always did, humming that old hymn she loved, Blessed Assurance. Her hands trembled a bit as she stirred the pot, and I offered to help. But she smiled and said, "One day you'll be making this for your grandchildren. Baby, let me enjoy spoiling you while I still can." She sat in her favorite spot by the window, her knitting needles dancing in rhythm as the sunlight poured over her like honey. Then suddenly, she stopped. Her hand reached for her chest. Her eyes widened. "Grandma," I asked. She didn't respond. She let out a soft gasp, dropped the yarn, and slumped over sideways. I screamed her name and ran to her side, shaking her fragile shoulders, begging her to wake up. She never did. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was already gone. The paramedics told Grandpa it was her heart, a sudden failure, they said, as if those two words could ever explain the silence that followed. 1 minute she was warmth and breath and presence, and the next, she was a memory. I sat on the porch steps in my pajamas, shivering in the autumn wind, the tips of my fingers still sticky with the brown sugar she had sprinkled into my bowl. I clutched the shawl she'd been knitting, only half finished, and pressed it against my face, trying to breathe her in. Grandpa Walt didn't say much that day. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the men carry her body out like it was a sack of potatoes instead of the woman who held this family together. He didn't cry. He didn't even flinch, just stood there, cold as stone. The funeral was held at First Baptist Church, small and quiet. I wore the navy dress Grandma had sewn for my last school recital. Jenny Malone's family sat beside me, but no one dared speak above a whisper. I remember the sound of the organ, the way the preacher's voice trembled when he read Psalm 23, and how tightly I held the folded handkerchief in my lap. Everyone said, "She's in a better place now." Everyone said, "She went peacefully." No one said, "Now who will protect this little girl that night?" The house was too quiet, too still. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall, my dress still clinging to me like a wet rag. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't moved in hours. My throat ached from crying, but my tears had dried up. I remember thinking, if I stay very still, maybe I can pretend today never happened. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, heavy, steady. At first I thought it might be the wind again. This house had always groaned when it settled, but the creaks moved in a pattern. Across the hallway, toward my room, the doorknob turned. I sat upright. My heart thudded against my ribs so loud I could hear it. "Grandpa," I whispered. He didn't answer. He stepped into the room. The hallway light cast a long shadow behind him. I could smell the faint sourness of whiskey in the air. He never drank around Grandma, but I guess he had started again. He looked at me not like I was his granddaughter, not like I was a child. His eyes were glassy, dark, unreadable. He walked toward me, slow and deliberate. I remember pressing my back against the headboard, suddenly aware that I was still wearing my funeral dress. My legs trembled. My hands clutched the edge of the blanket. "I never got to say goodbye," he muttered. "You look just like her. You know that I didn't know what to say. I didn't even understand what was happening. I wanted to believe he was just grieving, confused, lost without her. But when he sat on the edge of the bed and reached out his hand, something in my gut twisted. He touched my cheek, gently at first. Walt. Grandma's voice echoed in my mind. "You calm yourself down." But she wasn't there anymore. There was no one. I flinched. He noticed. "You're not scared of me, are you?" he asked. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, though it was a lie. Then his hand slid down my shoulder. That's when something primal kicked in. I shoved his hand away and scrambled off the bed, pressing myself against the wall. "Don't," I whispered. "Please." He stared at me for a moment long, hard, and then stood up. "I'm just trying to feel something," he said, his voice thick with booze and bitterness. "Ain't got nothing left." He turned and walked out, shutting the door behind him. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even move. I sat in the corner of my room until the sun came up. When I heard the rooster crow in the distance, I pulled on my coat and went outside barefoot, the frost biting my toes. I walked to the garden, her garden, the one she tended every morning. The carrots were still in the ground. The last of the pumpkins sat heavy and orange beneath withering leaves. I fell to my knees and wept. I wanted her back. I wanted to be held. I wanted to feel safe again. But safety was gone, and so was the woman who made my world make sense. And I knew, deep down, that whatever had just happened, it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. That was the first night, the first touch, the first betrayal, the first time I wished I didn't exist. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't even know the words for what I feared was coming, but I felt it. In the pit of my stomach, in the tightening of my chest, in the way the house no longer felt like home. From that night on, I lived on edge, listening for footsteps, watching every glance, holding my breath whenever the sun went down. because when Grandma died, the walls of that house closed in, and the monster I never knew had been living there all along stepped forward and took off his mask. After that first night, my world was no longer the world of a little girl. It was a narrow, suffocating tunnel where fear was the air I breathed and silence was the only thing that kept me alive. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I have told Jenny, my best friend? She still had both parents, still laughed at school dances and invited me to sleepovers where her dad grilled hot dogs in the backyard. I couldn't bring my darkness into her light. My teachers, Mrs. Harmon was kind, but I was just one quiet girl in a sea of students. What could I have said? My grandfather touched me even now. The words are hard to form. Back then, I didn't have them. I only had feelings raw, choking feelings that made my chest hurt every time I walked through the front door of that farmhouse. So I stayed silent. That silence became my armor, even as the wounds piled up beneath it. Grandpa Walt's abuse wasn't constant, not at first. He was methodical, like a snake that waited in the tall grass until you forgot it was there. Weeks would go by where he wouldn't say more than a grunt in my direction. Then one evening, I'd find him standing at the foot of my bed again, or worse, catching me alone in the hallway, his calloused hands on my shoulders, that dead look in his eyes. "I need you," he'd whisper, as if that made it love. It was never love. It was power, control, cruelty masked by confusion. He told me I reminded him of Grandma Evelyn. He said she'd never let him be close, and now it was my turn to make things right. God help me. I started to believe him. That's the part that breaks me the most, even now, at 12, 13, 14. I thought maybe I was the one doing something wrong. Maybe I hadn't fought hard enough. Maybe if I'd been louder, bolder, if I had screamed that first night, he'd be gone. But I didn't. I froze, like prey, like a rabbit in a trap. He knew that. He counted on it. By the time I turned 15, I had perfected the art of pretending. At school, I was polite, quiet, and obedient. My grades were fine, never exceptional. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the back of the classroom and avoided eye contact, hoping no one would see the bruises that sometimes marked my inner thighs or the tremor in my voice when someone brushed too close. At home, I moved like a ghost. I made his dinner. I washed his clothes. I kept the house spotless because I didn't want to give him any excuse to discipline me. He rarely hit me. His weapons were more insidious. The way he'd enter my room without knocking, the way he'd say, "Don't you look pretty tonight?" with that knowing sneer, the way he'd wait until the house was swallowed by moonlight and then come for me. There were nights when I'd press a chair against my door, sit awake in the dark with my knees pulled to my chest, just waiting, listening, always listening. He didn't always come, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. Sometimes I wondered if the neighbors suspected anything. We had a few down the road, the Dunns, the McLeods, but they mostly kept to themselves. Grandpa had a reputation as a hard man, but a respectable one, a veteran, a widower. Folks saw his scowl and called it strength. I saw it for what it was, emptiness wrapped in rage. Jenny tried, bless her heart. She kept inviting me over, kept asking why I always seemed so tired. I told her chores. I told her I had to help Grandpa now that Grandma was gone. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Once, when I was 16, she touched my arm and said, "You can talk to me, you know." And for one brief second, I almost did. But then I remembered what Grandpa Walt said the night before. If you open your mouth, I'll make sure no one ever believes you, and you'll end up in one of those places for crazy girls. So I swallowed the truth. Again, I lived like that for years. By the time I graduated high school, I had become a shell, a hollow version of the girl Grandma Evelyn raised. I no longer dreamed of college. I no longer dreamed of anything. I just wanted out. I got a part-time job cleaning at the local hardware store after school. I saved every penny. I planned to leave as soon as I turned 18. Run, change my name, vanish. But even escape was dangerous. He had eyes on me. He asked questions. He rifled through my dresser drawers when he thought I wasn't looking. You're not going anywhere, he told me once, cornering me in the kitchen. I made you. You're mine. That night, I took my savings and buried it under the chicken coop, just in case. One of the hardest parts about abuse is how it rearranges your sense of reality. I began to think maybe this was just what life was, that every girl went through something like this and just didn't talk about it. Maybe love always hurt. Maybe family always meant secrets. But deep down, I still had a sliver of hope. It was fragile, but it was mine, and it came in the form of a name I hadn't said aloud in years. Evelyn. I'd sit under the tree by the edge of our fields, where Grandma used to hang the laundry, and I'd whisper to her, "Please, send me a way out." I don't know if she heard me, but something shifted after that. It came in the form of a new neighbor, a woman named Carolyn Dunn, who had moved back to town to care for her sister. She was strong, sharp, and kind in the way Grandma used to be. One day, she stopped me on the road and said, "You're Marjorie, right? Evelyn's granddaughter." I knew her. You've got her eyes. And I broke, not in front of her, not yet. But that night, I lay in bed and sobbed for the first time in years, not from fear, but from longing. Someone remembered. Someone saw me. And maybe, just maybe, someone might help me. The first time I truly believed escape was possible. I was 17. It was the early spring of 1967. Snow had melted into muddy puddles that soaked the edges of the road, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. I remember standing at the bus stop one morning with my canvas satchel slung over my shoulder, staring at the Greyhound schedule Jenny had slipped into my locker at school. She didn't ask questions, just handed it to me with a gentle squeeze of my hand and a whisper, "If you ever need to go." I memorized the route Medora to Bismarck, then down to Rapid City. A girl could disappear in a city like that. I'd thought about it for months running. I had my savings stashed beneath the chicken coop, wrapped in a flour sack, just over $90. Not much, but enough for a one-way ticket, and maybe a few nights at a boarding house. Carolyn Dunn, the new neighbor, had started inviting me over more often. She lived in a little white cottage 2 fields over, with a porch swing that creaked just like Grandma's had. She made sweet tea with real mint and always asked about me in that gentle, no-pressure way. Everything okay at home, she'd ask, and I'd lie. "Yes, ma'am, just busy. That's all." But one day she reached over, placed her weathered hand on mine, and said, "You've got shadows behind those eyes. Marjorie, I knew your grandma. She'd want you safe." That night, I decided I would go. I waited until Grandpa fell asleep in his recliner. He always passed out around 10 p.m., half a bottle of whiskey gone, and the radio humming old country songs. I crept out to the coop, pulled the tin box from under the floorboards, and tiptoed back into the house to pack. I didn't take much: a change of clothes, Grandma's old rosary, The photo of her and me at the town picnic, both of us smiling like the world hadn't cracked yet. I was halfway to the road, my boots squelching in the wet earth, when I heard his voice. "Where do you think you're going?" I froze. Every inch of my body screamed run, but my feet refused. I turned slowly, clutching the satchel against my chest. His silhouette appeared behind me, illuminated by the porch light. He looked massive in the dark, bigger than I remembered, like he'd grown taller just to block my way. "You stealing from me now," he growled, pointing to the money in my hand. "No," I whispered. "It's mine. I earned it." His face twisted. "You don't get to leave. You think you can walk out of here after everything I've done for you, done to me," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He rushed at me so fast, I barely had time to react. The slap knocked me sideways, and I tasted blood. My knees hit the dirt. He yanked the bag from my hands and dragged me back toward the house like I was nothing more than a rag doll. Inside, he threw me down onto the wooden floor of the kitchen. "You ungrateful little bitch," he spat. "Everything I've done, and you betray me like this." I curled up, arms over my head, trembling. I thought he would kill me, and maybe part of me wanted him to anything to end the nightmare. But he didn't. He locked me in the cellar. The old storm cellar behind the house had been used for storing potatoes and canned goods. Now it became my prison. There was no light, no blanket, just dirt, concrete, and the stink of mildew. "I'll let you out when you learn your place," he snarled before slamming the door. I lost track of time down there. Hours bled into days. I cried until my throat went raw. I pounded the door until my fists bled. I slept curled in a corner, dreaming of Grandma Evelyn's soft voice telling me stories about stars and angels. I began to talk to her again. "Grandma." I tried. I whispered through cracked lips. I really tried. On the third day, or maybe the fourth. I'll never know. He opened the door, tossed down a piece of bread and a dented water bottle. "You gonna behave now?" he asked. I nodded, because what else could I do? He let me out, and I stumbled to my room, where I collapsed on the floor and didn't move until the next morning. My body ached, my skin bruised, but it was my soul that had taken the deepest beating. After that, I didn't try to run again, not for a long time. But something had changed. Something inside me had snapped, but not in the way he wanted. I didn't feel obedient. I didn't feel broken. I felt angry, quietly, silently, furiously angry. He thought locking me in that cellar would teach me fear. What he didn't realize was it taught me patience, and patience, I would come to learn, was the first step to survival. The first time I knocked on Carolyn Dunn's door without being invited, my hand shook so badly I had to clench it into a fist. I don't know what I was hoping for, maybe just a soft word, or a place to sit for a while that didn't reek of fear. I was 18 by then, just out of high school, and still stuck under Grandpa Walt's roof. The failed escape had made me careful, quieter, but it didn't kill my resolve. It only forced it deeper underground, like roots searching for another path to sunlight. Carolyn opened the door with that same mix of strength and kindness I'd come to associate with her. She looked like she had seen everything and survived all of its short silver hair, jeans worn thin at the knees, and eyes that didn't miss much. "Marjorie," she said, surprised but calm. "You all right?" I nodded, but my eyes betrayed me. I felt the tears before I could stop them. My lips parted, but I couldn't form the words. "Not yet." Carolyn stepped aside. "Come in, sweetheart." Her home was small, but warm walls lined with books, a kettle always ready, and old jazz records humming from the corner. She led me to the kitchen, poured sweet tea into a mason jar, and didn't push me to speak. She just sat across from me, quietly folding laundry while I stared at my trembling hands. After a long silence, I whispered, "He locked me in the cellar." She didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She just stopped folding and looked me straight in the eye. "Your grandfather." I nodded. "He found out I was trying to leave." A pause. Then, "Has he ever hurt you in other ways?" That question sat between us like a loaded gun. I looked down, ashamed. My voice barely carried across the table. "Yes." She reached over and placed her hand gently on top of mine. "You don't have to tell me everything unless you're ready. But Marjorie, you don't have to go back there." I cried, then not soft, quiet tears, but the kind that had waited years to be released. All the pain I had stuffed into the corners of my chest came rushing out, and Carolyn let it. She just held my hand and let me break. It was the first time in my life I felt seen, heard, believed. She let me stay the night in her guest room. I remember lying in that unfamiliar bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering if I was safe for real or just borrowing someone else's peace. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't flinch at every creak in the floor either. That was a miracle on its own. In the morning, she made pancakes, not because I asked, but because she knew comfort could be served warm with maple syrup. "I can help you get out," she said gently, "but you need to trust me. We'll do this right. No more running in the night. We'll go through the law." The law. I didn't trust it. I'd heard stories girls like me not being believed, getting sent back home, or worse. But Carolyn looked me in the eye and said, "I was a nurse in the Army. I've seen girls survive worse than him, and I've helped them reclaim their lives. We do this smart, and we do this together." That word together was everything. She brought in a social worker named Janice Bailey, a woman with a sharp bob haircut, wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice full of fire. Janice asked hard questions. I had to tell my story in pieces, sometimes through sobs, sometimes through silence, but she never rushed me, never doubted me. They documented everything: bruises, journal entries, the hidden stash of money that Grandpa had taken. Carolyn even testified that she had witnessed his rage once from across the fence line, when he screamed at me for letting the hens out of the coop. "That man," she said, "carries poison in his bones." For weeks. I stayed with Carolyn under the radar. She helped me find part-time work at the diner in town. I used a false name on the schedule to avoid attention. Every night, we planned. Every night, I dared to hope. Then one evening, Carolyn said the words I never thought I'd hear. "We have enough. The county is issuing an investigation." I stared at her, blinking. "They believe me. They believe you," she said. That night, I sat alone on her porch swing. The same wind that once chilled me now felt clean against my skin. I looked up at the stars and whispered, "Grandma, you sent her, didn't you?" The investigation moved slowly, too slowly for my liking, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I had a team now, people who cared, people who fought for me. The man who once towered over me now felt small. He didn't know it yet, but his grip on me was slipping. The world was shifting. My silence had cracked. And from the cracks, light was finally coming through. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's slow, deliberate. Sometimes it looks like silence until the right moment comes. and the silence turns to thunder. When I agreed to work with Janice Bailey and the county's investigation team, I didn't do it with thoughts of revenge in my heart. At first, all I wanted was to survive. But as the days passed, survival didn't feel like enough, not after everything that man took from me. I wanted to reclaim something, my name, my truth, my voice, and yes, I wanted him to pay. The investigation started quietly. Janice filed reports through the Department of Child and Family Services, even though I was legally 18. She said, "Just because you turned 18 doesn't mean the abuse you endured disappears. The law doesn't get to pretend you weren't a child when it began." She was fierce like that. Fierce in a way I didn't yet know how to be. She gathered statements from my teachers. Mrs. Harmon remembered the time I came to class with bruises on my arms and a vacant stare that made her stomach twist. Jenny Malone gave a tearful account of how I'd withdrawn from everyone during high school, how I flinched when someone raised their voice. And Carolyn Dunn, my savior, kept notes, photos, timelines. One by one, they built a case, and one by one, I started taking back what he'd stolen. The first time I stood in front of a judge, I couldn't stop shaking. I wore a borrowed navy blue skirt and a white blouse that Carolyn had ironed for me that morning. My palms were damp, my throat tight. But when the judge asked, "Ms. Reed, are you willing to testify to what happened to you in your home?" I said yes. My voice cracked, but I said it. I told the story. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to freeze the courtroom. Enough to make two people in the pews cry. Enough to make Grandpa Walt's attorney shift uncomfortably in his seat. Grandpa didn't look at me. He sat there like he always had, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes flat, but I saw it the flicker of fear, the realization that I wasn't hiding anymore. That was the first cut. The second came when they served a search warrant for the property. Janice and a deputy sheriff uncovered a journal I had written pieces of, hidden in a cereal box beneath the floorboard of my closet. It contained months of entries, descriptions of what he did, dates, even the words he used. They found the lock on the storm cellar door, the old leather belt with his initials branded into it. They found the hidden bottle of whiskey in his bedroom drawer, and the receipt he'd kept from the hardware store proof he'd bought that new lock the same month I'd tried to run. Piece by piece, his armor cracked. The third came when they filed charges: unlawful imprisonment, sexual abuse, assault of a minor. It wasn't everything. Statutes of limitations meant some charges couldn't be brought, but it was enough to drag his name into the light. And in a town like Medora, light travels fast. People began to talk. Some didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. Walt Reed, a church-going war veteran. But others, they remembered things. That look in his eye. The way Evelyn never left Marjorie alone with him. The way she seemed tired, burdened, before her death. Carolyn told me, truth doesn't always come like a hammer. Sometimes it's water wearing down the rock. You keep telling it, and eventually it carves through. That was my revenge. Not screaming, not slashing his tires or keying his truck. No, mine came through paper, courtrooms, and whispered conversations that grew louder by the day. He was ordered to appear in court every month for hearings. He came dressed in the same gray suit he wore to Grandma Evelyn's funeral, looking like a man whose time had finally caught up to him. And still, he never said a word, never apologized, never even tried to explain. I stopped expecting it. You can't pull remorse from stone, but I didn't need his apology. What I needed was to stand, speak, be heard. Each time I testified, I grew a little taller inside, a little stronger. It was painful, dear God. It was painful, but also cleansing, like fire to rot. My final testimony came one cold January morning. The courtroom was half full. Carolyn sat behind me, Janice beside me. I read a letter aloud to the judge, not to ask for more punishment, but to tell the world that I was more than what he'd done to me. I am not just the girl he hurt. I said, I am the woman who survived him. It was quiet when I finished. The judge gave him 3 years in a state facility, something of a miracle considering the time that had passed. But to me, it wasn't about how long he'd serve. It was about the fact that, finally, he was the one in the cage, not me. I walked out of that courtroom with my head held high. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for footsteps in the dark. I was free, and freedom, after so many years in the shadows, tasted like oxygen. That night, I sat on Carolyn's porch swing again, wrapped in a thick quilt, mug of tea in my hand, and I let myself exhale. I thought about Grandma Evelyn. I imagined her standing beside me, hand on my shoulder, proud of the woman I'd become. I whispered into the night, I did it, Grandma. I kept going. Revenge, in the end, wasn't about making him suffer. It was about taking myself back, one piece at a time. When the courthouse door closed behind me that last time, it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. I was 21, legally free, but more importantly, spiritually, emotionally, finally untethered from the man who had haunted every corner of my life. It was a strange feeling at first. I'd been captive for so long that freedom felt unfamiliar, like wearing someone else's shoes. I didn't quite know how to walk in it yet, but I was determined to learn. Carolyn helped me find a place of my own, just a small upstairs rental above the bakery on Main Street. 2 rooms, a squeaky floor, a window that overlooked the hills. To most, it was modest, but to me, it was a palace. My first night there, I sat on the floor with a borrowed pillow and a single suitcase, staring at the bare walls, smiling like a fool. I was alone, but not in fear. I was alone in choice. I painted those walls myself, bought cheap curtains from the thrift store, slowly filled the shelves with used books, hand-me-down dishes, and little reminders of the girl I used to be, the one Grandma Evelyn had raised before everything went dark. I started working full-time at the diner downtown. It was hard work, long hours, but it kept my hands busy and my mind steady. I liked the routine. I liked the clatter of plates, the smell of fresh coffee, and the regulars who called me darlin' and tipped in quarters and smiles. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings I couldn't get out of bed, nights when a sound would jolt me from sleep, my body remembering things my heart tried to forget. Trauma doesn't vanish. It lingers. It whispers. It tests you. But with therapy, something Carolyn gently insisted on, I learned how to name the pain. I learned how to separate the past from the present. I began journaling again, just like I had when I was a girl. Only this time, my words weren't hidden in a cereal box. I kept a blue leather notebook on my nightstand and filled it with everything: my fears, my memories, my victories, big and small. I made it through the whole day without flinching. I smiled at myself in the mirror this morning. I said no to something and meant it. Little steps, but steps forward all the same. Carolyn remained in my life, not just as a protector, but as a friend. Some evenings, we'd sit on her porch and drink sweet tea as the sun dipped behind the fields. She never pushed, never pried, just listened when I needed to talk, and held space for the quiet when I didn't. One warm June afternoon, she surprised me. "I've been thinking," she said. "You ever considered going back to school?" I laughed. "Me school. I barely made it through high school." She smiled that stubborn smile of hers. "You're smart, Marjorie, and strong. That combination can move mountains." It took me a while, but I finally listened. I enrolled in a local community college part-time, started with night classes, English, psychology, a little sociology. I was the oldest one there, surrounded by kids 10 years younger, but I didn't care. For the first time, I wasn't learning to escape. I was learning to grow, and I loved it. Every textbook, every lecture, every paper I wrote felt like one more stone laid on the path back to myself. I eventually earned a certification in counseling support services. It wasn't a fancy degree, but it gave me purpose. I began volunteering at a local crisis center, working the phones, talking to girls and women whose stories felt all too familiar. Sometimes I cried with them. Other times I just listened like Carolyn had listened to me. I never told them all the details of my past. I didn't have to. They saw it in my eyes. They heard it in the way I said, "You're not alone. I believe you." That phrase, "I believe you," became my mission, because no one said it to me when I was 12 or 13 or 15. But now I could say it for others. It was in that work quiet, invisible, powerful that I found my healing, not revenge, not justice, not even freedom, but healing. And in that healing, I discovered something I never expected: joy, not loud joy. Not parade joy, but quiet, steady joy that lived in cups of coffee shared with new friends, in early morning sunrises over the plains, in the laughter of a child at the diner counter, in the way the wind rustled through the cottonwoods like a lullaby only Evelyn would understand. I still think of her every day. I keep her picture framed above my kitchen sink. She's standing in her garden, a wide straw hat on her head, holding a basket of tomatoes. That picture reminds me where I came from and who I was always meant to become. I never set out to build anything, not a career, not a reputation, and certainly not an empire. All I ever wanted was peace, a safe place to rest my bones, and a way to make sense of the wreckage that man left behind. But healing has a funny way of spreading once it finds room to grow. Like wildflowers on prairie land, quiet at first, and then suddenly everywhere. It started with the crisis center. A few shifts a week turned into more. Soon, I was helping train volunteers, organizing community events, even speaking at small gatherings. My voice, the one that had once been buried under fear and shame, had become a light for others to follow. One spring, a teenage girl came into the center shaking so badly she couldn't even look me in the eye. She was thin, bruised, and barely 16. Her uncle had done to her what my grandfather had done to me. I sat with her for hours, held her hand, let her cry until she couldn't cry anymore. Before she left, she whispered, "I thought no one would ever believe me," and I said, "I used to feel the same way. But we believe you here and will help you start again." That girl, her name was Shelby, would go on to become a counselor herself. She still writes to me every Christmas. And that's when the idea came. Not a big one, not at first. Just a thought that tickled the back of my mind. What if we created a place just for women like her, like me, not just a shelter, but a sanctuary, a place to reclaim yourself? With the help of Carolyn, who donated her savings from selling her family's land, and Janice, who still worked in social services and knew every grant writer in the county. We bought a small house on the edge of town, white picket fence, 3 bedrooms, a little garden out back that reminded me of Grandma Evelyn's. We called it Evelyn House. The day we opened, I planted marigolds by the front steps and whispered, "This is for you, Grandma, and for every girl you couldn't protect, but I can." Evelyn House became more than I could have dreamed. We hosted support groups twice a week, brought in therapists, social workers, career advisors. We taught women how to cook, sew, write resumes, speak their truth. We kept the lights on through donations, fundraisers, and more volunteer hours than I can count. But most of all, we kept promises. We promised that no woman who walked through that door would be silenced again, that they would be believed, held, helped, and that they would never be alone in their healing. The community rallied around us. Not everyone, of course. Some folks still whispered behind closed doors. Why bring up the past, they'd ask. Why stir up old pain? But the women we served knew why. Because silence kills and truth saves. Over the years, Evelyn House expanded to include a second location in Bismarck, then a small scholarship fund for survivors who wanted to go back to school. We didn't have billboards or fancy commercials, but word spread. A quiet empire of hope, built not on vengeance, but on healing. And I was just Marjorie, still working the front desk on Mondays, still brewing the strongest coffee in the break room, still sitting on the porch swing at dusk, thanking God I was given enough time on this earth to make something good out of the worst thing that ever happened to me. Sometimes I think back to that night when I was 12, when my grandfather opened my bedroom door and shattered the world I knew. For years, I thought that night had defined me, but it didn't. It redirected me. It broke me open so I could become something new. And now, when I walk through the halls of Evelyn House and see a woman smiling softly as she chops onions for dinner, or hear the gentle laughter of a child whose mother is finally safe, I know this is the life I was meant to build. From ashes, from silence, from strength. I've lived a long life, long enough to know that healing doesn't follow a straight line. It twists. It falls apart. It rebuilds itself when you least expect it. There were days I wanted to disappear, nights when I begged the sky to take me, and mornings when I woke up and realized I had survived one more day. Now, when I sit in my rocking chair by the window, watching the sun rise over the hills of Medora, I no longer feel haunted. I feel grateful. Grateful for Carolyn, who saw me. Grateful for Janice, who fought for me. Grateful for Shelby, and every woman who found her voice through Evelyn House. Grateful for the girl I once was, trembling in the dark but refusing to go silent. My grandfather died in prison. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't speak his name again until I shared this story, but I forgave him not for his sake, but for mine, because hate is heavy, and I carried his darkness long enough. Now I carry light. I carry the memory of Grandma Evelyn's laughter in the garden. I carry the warmth of Carolyn's hand on mine that first night I knocked on her door. I carry the courage of every woman who's ever said, "It happened to me too," and kept going. If you're listening to this and you've lived through pain you never thought you'd survive, please hear me. You are not broken. You are not what they did to you. And you are never, ever too old to begin again. The past cannot be changed, but the future, it is still yours, still waiting, still wide open like the Dakota sky. All it takes is one step, one truth, one whisper that says, I deserve more than this. That whisper saved my life. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey or someone you love, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. Share your voice. Because every story spoken out loud helps silence the shame that holds so many back. And if you believe, like I do, that stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps more survivors know they're not alone and that their next chapter can begin today. Thank you for listening to mine. With love and strength, Marjorie Reed.